Star, we have had one boss lady, it's time for another boss lady. If you peruse her bio, you might find the small matter that she is not born in Jamaica, but at various points in her career, she has spent a lot of time working here and following Jamaica's economic progress. She's not a wagonist. She was here with us during the hard times and is such a great friend of Jamaica that, unlike her colleague who will speak to us later, we're not at the point of trying to convert her. We already consider her Jamaican and one of us. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together and give a warm welcome to the General Manager, Country Department Caribbean Group of the IDB, none other than Ms. Therese Turner-Jones.
I love to see the ladies take full control. Independent woman don't depend on a soul.
That's right.
Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? You can call me by my name. I am ready to roll.
I feel like a rock star here today, I must tell you. This is a great day at the office for me. First of all, I want to congratulate the Bank of Jamaica for putting on an excellent series of seminars on a topic that is not so easy to understand for the average person. I think we understand when prices go up and we can't afford to buy something, and then we think about it, but we don't call it inflation. We just say prices are too high, I'm going to skip buying that item. So this is really an excellent use of the resources of the Bank of Jamaica to help demystify, as the series has been called, this topic because it affects everybody. And, I have a long history with the Bank of Jamaica. It was my second IMF assignment as a young economist. I know I look young now, but I was even younger then. And I spent a lot of time in this building, crunching numbers and doing Excel spreadsheets and working exactly on this topic. So I feel like, seriously, I have goosebumps being here today because to see where the bank is in terms of its capacity, its analysis. No other central bank in this region, and even throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, is doing what we're doing today and right now. And so this bank, under the great leadership of Brian Winter and now our soon-to-be new governor, Richard Biles, that was just announced for those of you who are having coffee. I think, the Jamaica is in a good place with monetary policy. So a lot has already been said about why we're here and what we're doing. And as Tony mentioned, I'm going to go a little bit down an historical lane just because I think it's important to position this current situation vis-a-vis where Jamaica used to be. And I have about 12 slides, but I can go quickly on some of those. But I think it's important that everybody gets a sense of why we're here, why we're talking about this. For people who probably don't know about the period, before 1991, or even that bumpy period between 1991 up to 2000 in Jamaica, it's important to go back there. So I'm going to take you there. Why do we care about inflation? I think Carol did a fantastic job talking about what's in the basket, what we measure, why we measure it, and how we get there. But really, inflation can be a tax, right? If it's too high, it discombobulates everything. Investment decisions, especially poor people can't really make ends meet. And we talked a lot about what's in the basket, the weight of different items. But when you look at the composition, Carol did a fantastic job. I'm not going to go through that again. But 40% of the CPI basket is basically food and beverages, and another 20%, shelter, basically, and how people are living. So if those items are moving up quickly, then you can see where people's lives are affected pretty drastically. So what we want to do is mitigate that, and so we want inflation that's predictable, and we want inflation to be, generally low, as we've been talking all along, because it's the heartbeat, and I agree, low inflation is the heartbeat. So if we look at where Jamaica is coming from over a long period of time, we can start with 1960. Actually, that was the year I was born. to the present. And so the monetary policy of the Central Bank of Jamaica has been pretty mixed in terms of what it was focused on. Uma mentioned a nominal anchor. At one point it was base money, so that's that money targeting piece between 1990 and say 2002. The exchange rate peg has been sort of the nominal anchor for a long time before that, but basically Jamaica had almost like a fixed exchange rate, even though there was some movements in the rate. And then, since sort of like the early 2000s, we had some kind of a crawl like with exchange rate, where the exchange rate really became the nominal anchor. And the great thing about inflation being the nominal anchor now is that we don't have to obsess about the exchange rate. So when I worked in Jamaica in the 1990s, of course, the exchange rate was everything that everybody talked about. And why was that? Jamaica at that moment had lots of foreign exchange shortages, lots of macroeconomic crises of various kinds. And essentially, at one point, inflation was over 100% at one point, but on average, the highest point seeing on this chart is like up to 85%. When the peg was abandoned in 1991, and that took things in a very, very awkward position after that. Carrie-Anne did a really good analysis of what are some of those other aspects that get into thinking about inflation. And so those other aspects, those other factors, the fiscal situation, commodity prices up and down, especially with oil, and the current account deficit really affected the trajectory of inflation, but also the macroeconomic outlook of Jamaica over long periods of economic history since 1980 up to, say, 2016. What has changed since then? So everybody knows that in May of 2013, the IMF agreement started. By the way, that was the day I also started my work as the IDB representative in Jamaica. So if you want to track good progress in Jamaica, TTJ arrived on May 1st, 2013. But basically, a lot has changed in Jamaica's macroeconomic and economic management of the country. Right now, there's a fiscal rule under the Fiscal Responsibility Act. That was work that was done largely under the auspices of the IDB. Fiscal consolidation has been outstanding since 2013. We know that the debt has moved from like 150% of GDP down to 96% now. We talked a lot this morning already about the primary surplus and the fact that under the program it was 7.5% and now down to 6.5%. And basically that's allowed the government to reduce the debt to GDP ratio, bring down the debt trajectory quite substantially over the last 6-year period. Why that's important is because too much of the government revenues had to be allocated to debt service. So that puts a huge drag on what the government can do, no fiscal space to do important infrastructure projects and so on. We also know that over that period, what has changed is that we've moved from a crawl-like exchange rate management to a flexible, freely floating, market-determined exchange rate, and I think that's really important. And then, of course, this big green thing which says the introduction of formal inflation targeting regime, which we're talking about this morning, which started in 2018. So why do this? I think Carrie-Anne, again, did a lot of talking about this, but essentially what we want to do in this kind of framework is keep confidence high, not just consumers, but also investors. We talked a lot about price stability and the fact that having inflation within a targeted range gives a lot of predictability to the policy environment, so whether you're an investor or consumer, you can make better decisions. We, as was also pointed out by Carrie-Anne this morning, there's a transparent target for inflation, and there's a clear way to getting there for that path. I know it seems not so clear for some people in this room, but as an economist, really, I think we have to trust that the analysis that's being done by the Research Department and the Monetary Policy Committee at the bank, that what they're doing is the right approach. And also, there's this point about insulating the Bank of Jamaica from the fiscal authorities. In other words, trying to protect monetary policy from basically, rogue politicians. That's basically what we're saying. And then we take away the issue of the exchange rate being the thing we obsess about, but we allow the exchange rate to really be that flexible instrument in the event that there are external shocks. And we know what some of those shocks can be, whether it's some terrible 9/11 type event in the US or elsewhere in the world, or whether it's a big oil price shock, or whether it's some climate disaster. So all of these things are coming into the mix. We talked a little bit this morning also, Uma mentioned about what are some of the preconditions for making this work well. And I must say, I want to focus on the top two, because while all 5 of these are important, fiscal discipline is probably as important as central bank independence. Uma mentioned fiscal independence. Basically, these 2 things go together. And the interesting thing is, and I'm going to get to that a little bit in the slides, fiscal discipline is really going to be probably the most important one to focus on because of Jamaica's history, economic history, but also because of how governments tend to either manage well their public finances or not. Explicit targets, I think that's clear. Having effective instruments of monetary policy, and we talked a lot about that, Carrie Ann, this morning, about what are some of these instruments, open market operations, the policy rate, and others. And of course, credibility, transparency, communications. There is no other central bank in the world, I think, doing communications the way BOJ is doing it. I mean, who would have thought reggae videos and so on to communicate this message? But I think it has a lot of value in that we're taking a cultural medium and communicating very complex issues. And I would suggest to Carol that she hire Tony for a little while and help break down some of the more complicated statistical issues, because basically what we're trying to do is get the economy to function and everybody in Jamaica to think about how data can be used in a way that is mainstream. I mean, we should be talking about price increases, or we should be talking about the size of the debt, or we should be talking about whether GDP is growing by 1% or 2%. That should just be a normal conversation that everybody can have because we understand what the numbers mean. And the only way to do that is if everybody becomes comfortable with data and we start sharing that information and sharing it openly and freely. So look out for the reggae videos on GDP coming up soon. Right, Carol? I'll help you fund that if you like. On inflation targeting, Jamaica's not alone in this. Right now, there are 41 countries who do this. This chart has, I think, 36 countries. This was up to 2016. But if you add Jamaica and some others since 2016, there are a lot of countries doing this because it works. It works, and it works fairly well. If we just to look at some of the countries and some of the experiences to show you how it works, we're looking at Brazil, Australia, Canada, and Chile. In June 1999, Brazil adopted inflation targeting. In 1999, inflation was about 8%. And in 2019, with inflation targeting, they now have, their target is something like 4.25, plus or minus 1.5%. In Australia, in March of 1993, the target was set at 2 to 3%. It's been pretty consistent. In Canada, again, March 1991, that's a long time. 2% plus or minus 1% is their target. In Chile, in May of 1999, it was set at 15% to 20, and now it's down to 3 to 1. So countries have lots of experience of doing this. And we know that it's effective because it shows up in the data. So, for example, in Australia, before the inflation targeting regime, inflation was running average inflation at 8, almost 9%. And after the inflation targeting regime was adopted, it's now it's about 2.5%. So that's 6 percentage points decline in inflation just because of a different way of trying to manage this regime. Again, in Brazil, which when they started, inflation was around almost 160%. And after the inflation targeting regime, almost less than 7%. So you can see that it works. It also has an impact on average unemployment. In Australia, you can see unemployment drop. Growth actually increased in Australia, and those results also hold for Brazil and Chile, which is the upper right-hand corner. So we know it works, and we're looking for similar results here in Jamaica. This chart is a complicated one, but it sort of looks at what Carrie-Anne was saying, how it plays out in a chart. So some of the things that the Central Bank of Jamaica has been doing, she mentioned that the policy rate has dropped by over 300 basis points. They've actually made 10 rate reductions since January of 2018. So there's a lot of management under this framework. So it's, they're not just sitting there looking at the data and not doing anything. It's a lot of active involvement in the policy. They've also had 2 reserve requirement reductions. So instead of the banks having to hold reserve requirements of 12%, that's the amount of the reserves that all the banks put in the central bank in the event of some bad thing happening in banks. That's now been reduced to 7%. And we all know that bankers don't like high reserve requirements because it affects how much money they can lend, and it also reduces their profit margins. So this sums up a lot of what Carrie-Anne has already mentioned, so I'm not going to talk too much more about it. But these are the instruments, the policy rate, the reserve requirements to manage that, the inflation rate will meet somewhere between 4% and 6%. And then if you look at what has actually happened to inflation since January of last year, started at about 4.8%, which is well within the target, dipped a bit. We heard a lot about that in the news last year. Why is inflation so low? And we now see it back to 3.9, which is just about in the target range. So that was at the end of April this year. Now, finally, what's been done so far, I think we talked a lot about that already. Fiscal discipline and flexibility has been achieved under this framework. The floating exchange rate seems to be working. The explicit target and overnight rate for policy has been used as one of the main instruments. I would say that based on what's happened with investor confidence as well as consumer confidence, credibility and transparency is allowing the Bank of Jamaica to have the credibility and transparency that they imagine under this kind of framework. So what's left to do? So I think that's part of where the story goes. So we need to finish up the fiscal reforms. And for those of you who can recall, Minister of Finance speech, his first budget speech, he mentioned the creation of a fiscal council. So the fiscal council, I think, is the next big piece that will be an important partner to this marriage of really open, good economic management. An independent central bank on the one hand, and a fiscal council on the other hand, to give Jamaican policymakers the right amount of, how should I say, oversight is probably the best way to describe it, to look at policies. So Uma mentioned earlier the central bank independence. We talked about that this morning. So getting Parliament to approve the amendments that they're currently debating, I think they're at page 28 of 32 pages, is what I've been told. So that should be done soon. And of course, public sector reforms to further increase fiscal space and flexibility. That all has to do with making state-owned enterprises more efficient, making the public sector more efficient and modernized. And there, I would say this is where a lot of work needs to be done on moving Jamaica to a digital, moving it higher in terms of a digital economy. There's a lot of work to be done there. Some of you know about the national identification system, having a digital ID, moving to the digitization of government records, having interoperability between databases that sit in one ministry that speak to another ministry, so that's really important. And then, of course, although I see a lot of rigor already in the analytical capacity of the Bank of Jamaica, you know, you can never have enough intelligence there, so further capacity for supervision, forecasting, and communication. But of course, on communication, I think I don't know how much more they can take this, but maybe, you know, I don't know, movies, regular videos on TV about monetary policy. But yeah, that's what's left to be done. So I think that's it. Thank you very much. Look forward to the questions.